Ha! This is Laborc, and it is so nice to have you here. Papa Laborc, your mustache is looking so great. Thank you for noticing, it's so nice of you. These are the paints you need. We start with the face. It always helps Papa Laborc to finish the face of the miniature first, because we have the most focus and energy at the beginning of our painting session. And it's nice to nail this part first. I'm using bugmans glue to sketch out the highlights. We don't have much surface to work with thanks to these goggles, but focus on the major highlight areas on the face, like the nose, cheeks and chin. After that, we blend in the color with some glazes. You can paint the recesses, but don't let the paint pool in there. We need those wrinkles because Jebediah is not a young guy. If you let the paint pool in the recesses of an old face, you basically make him younger. Then cover the inside of the mouth with word barrels red, but you can leave it black too. It's just a personal preference. Now we paint the teeth and the eye socket black. This is Papa Laborc's pre-blacklining method. It will create a nice definition in the following steps if we leave just a tiny bit of this black. Let's pick out the teeth with ivory. I try to make some vertical super tiny lines, make sure your paint covers well with a base layer consistency, and try to leave some tiny black lines between the teeth and the lips. If your vision is not the best, just use a magnifying glass for details like this. It will help you a little bit. If you don't see some of these details, just focus on the motion of your brush rather on what you see or don't see. As you can tell, I'm making the motion with the brush before touching the mini, so I can feel how much pressure I need to apply on the brush. It's very gentle, like when combing granny's thin hair. Same goes for the eye, and don't forget to leave a little bit of that black outline. It's not easy, but we only need to do this right one time. I mean, if we don't screw up the iris. And of course we did screw up the iris, so I need to slap on my tiny hand, but I will slap on yours too if you make a mistake. So we redo it until it looks right. There are many parts on the miniature that we don't need to spend too much time on, but getting the eyes right is crucial. Now let's reduce the highlight areas on the face with cadian fleshtone. Just a few brush strokes on the nose, cheeks and chin, and we are good to go. Continue the process with kislev flesh. Be very careful with it, we need the previous layers to have a smooth finish on the gradient of the skin. I forgot to record, but I applied some purple ink into the shadowy parts and recesses with a very diluted consistency, and here I'm applying the final highlights on the face with a mix of kislev flesh and ice yellow. The next part is the beard. I cover the whole thing with eshin gray, leaving some black between the ends of the hairs. Just at the end. You don't need to pick out the hairs one by one with this color. Let's mix some ice yellow to the eshin gray so we have this medium gray color and reduce the highlight area on the beard and his hair. Same layering method like with the previous layer, just reduce the highlight areas and only pick out the hairs separately where you want to end the transition. Let's add a bit more ice yellow to the mix so we have our light gray. Now this time we only pick out the hairs separately and focusing on the ones closer to the face. This looks so much like Granny's hair on her feet. Now we use the same colors to paint his shirt. Since it's an old white shirt, we need very little pure black for the shadows, so you can cover 95% of the shirt with eshin gray and only leave the extreme shadows black. I'm blending in this face too with a thinner paint consistency and pulling the paint from the shadowy parts to smooth out the transition. With the same mixture we used before, I sketch out the highlights. I'm using thin layers to do that and apply a couple of layers of glaze where I'm not satisfied with a certain gradient. Remember to always pull the paint in the same direction with every brush stroke. Otherwise it won't look smooth and you will end up with a big slap on your tiny hand. Let's add a bit more ice yellow to the mixture and reduce the highlight areas even more. I'm using thin layers so I can work with it more easily. If you're comfortable with wet blending, you can do that too. Now let's push the contrast a bit more with ice yellow. Really tiny portions on the cloth, and as you can see I'm working more on the right side of the mini, so we have a better idea where the light is coming from. Let's continue to work on the hat and gloves. I mix some thondia brown with black to create this dark leather look. Use a base layer consistency and try not to stain the white shirt or I will slap on your tiny hand. Then we continue with pure thondia brown to sketch some highlights upon the wrinkled surface of the gloves. I'm using a thinner consistency now and I won't apply any glazes to indicate a rougher texture with the lack of blending. Now I add some ice yellow to sketch out the brightest highlights. You don't need to paint connected lines. You can apply the paint by stippling small dots and scratches, so the gloves will have more texture to them. These gloves are probably used by the tinkerer every day, so it doesn't need to look like they are brand new. To tone back the highlights a bit and have a satin finish on the leather, I apply 2 very thin layers of browning to the hats and gloves. If you do not dilute the ink, you will lose more contrast and we try to avoid that. We want to introduce some new tones to the leather and not getting slaps on our tiny hands. So, no Mickey Mouse. For the apron, I mix some thondia brown with tallarn sand to have a different leather color. The recesses on the apron stayed black, so I glazed some of the previous layer over the shadows to smooth out the transitions. It's very important that you won't let the paint pool in the crevices, otherwise it's going to look weird with some bright shadows. With pure tallarn sand, I reduce the highlight areas and apply the paint a bit more roughly to communicate that the apron is worn down by everyday use. Try to apply the paint with stippling and it will create some nice texture over the leather. Now with a bit more ice yellow to the tallarn sand, I continue the stippling process. These highlights are bright, but the older and worn down a leather is, the more these highlights are needed. To smooth this part a bit, I applied a couple of layers of glaze and with that, the apron and the strap on his head is done. After that, I painted all the metal parts on the mini with eshin grey. There is only one detail left on the head and that is the goggles. I used this blue because there is no way I can pronounce the name of it as a base coat for the small lens. After that, I applied some baharroth blue to the bottom part of the lens. I mixed some ice yellow to the baharroth blue and created a tiny dot on the top part of the lens. This will read as they are shiny little objects. You can even use ivory or white for this, but this bright yellowish tone works fine too. For the frame of the goggles, I mixed some ivory with eshin grey and painted the circle shapes left and the right side, leaving a little part between them darker. With a brighter mixture, I increased the contrast so these tiny parts have some NMM feel to them. Added some ice yellow to the mixture and continued the process. Try to be careful with your paint consistency, you don't want these bright colors to run into the recesses of the goggles. Lastly, I created some super tiny highlights with ivory. A dot in the dark part and another to the bright, so it will create a nice shiny metal effect. With that, the goggles are done. I started working on his wrench. I'm using the same steps like I did with the goggles and same colors too. Only difference is I use glazes to blend the colors. To sum it up, I sketch the highlights and keep increasing the contrast on them and smooth out the transition between the layers. Obviously you need to have an idea where to place the highlights, but a highlight reference photo can help you with that. When I'm painting miniatures, I use these photos all the time to help me with not just the highlight placement, but for the highlight values as well. You need to keep in mind that some highlights can be muted back or exaggerated more depending on what material we are painting. Since it's metal, which is very reflective, you can go from black to some extreme white highlights. Between these steps, I always go back and blackline between the screws and the recesses to make them more defined. I pick out the screws and edge highlight some with ivory. Use a base layer consistency to do that. Then I went back and highlight some sections on the wood with mournfang brown, using thin layers. After that, I applied 2 thin coats of army painter dark tone. You can obviously blackline between the wood grain, but if you value your sanity, rather use some washes for that purpose. Then I went back and highlight some sections on the wood with mournfang brown using thin layers. To add a bit of an orangish brown tone to the wood, I used deathclaw brown. There are some parts to the chair that would be more worn, like around the edges, so you can be braver with the highlight placements there. For the last highlight on the wood, I used ushabti bone. This cream color is perfect for the final highlights and flows nicely from the brush. If you prefer a satin finish to the wood, feel free to apply some thin coat of brown ink or wash. Papa Laborc is happy with it as it is, so the wheelchair is done. I continued to work on the rest of the NMM on the chair. It's a big chunk of work, so feeling a little bit crippled by the task is quite normal. Some of you guys started your journey with NMM with Papa Laborc's tutorials, and I couldn't be more proud of that. Papa Laborc remembers when he first tried to paint NMM. It was a zombicide miniature from the Friends and Foes expansion. I was so excited to do it and afraid at the same time because I had no clue how to do it. Still, I was pretty happy about the result and shared it on my Instagram. Looking at it now, it didn't look like much, but it was an important milestone. It's one of the best things in life when you can reflect on where you started and see yourself how far you have come. One more important thing. You shouldn't compare yourself to others. Yeah, Papa Laborc, we heard that 100 times. Well, maybe you need to hear it one more time, because you forgot the previous 100 ones. Like Granny Laborc with her Alzheimer. I told her that Granny, we talked about this a couple of times, but you have Alzheimer's. And she always replied the same. I don't remember asking you a goddamn thing. so try to keep track of your progress, because it can be the most motivating and rewarding thing in life. It's good for you. At this part, I tried to figure out what that thing's supposed to be between the wheels. Turns out it's some sort of exhaustion for the chair, but let's just say it was not the best sculpted one. You see, the venting holes are surrounded by mod lines and they are not placed very evenly. So I just grabbed the blade and shaved the whole thing. With Simon Minis, I'm sure you guys have your fair share fighting this, and sometimes after priming a miniature they just won't stop appearing. For the most part, you can cut them off without a problem, but in some cases you need to cut off the details too. It's a tough trade, but it's worth it in my opinion. As you can see, this is how this cylinder shape looks after painting. It's just a plain cylinder now, but I rather have this than something ugly and rigid. Well, Papa Laborc got a little too excited and underestimated his drilling skills. Yeah, I tried to create those holes with a drill, but it wasn't the best idea. So later I covered them with green stuff and repainted the whole thing. Again. It's really important to mention that Papa Laborc totally didn't get frustrated that he ruined his previous work, and it was a fun and relaxing process altogether. Then I went back and continued to work on the NMM. Since I'm doing the same thing over and over again, I just showed this footage because it might help some of you guys with the highlight placements. To be honest, most of the time I just wing these highlights. NMM is kind of an easy in that regard, because metals are very reflective and could have lots and lots of reflections on their surface. You don't have to focus on the idea that light is coming from one direction all the time. It definitely helps to make the brightest highlights more believable, but try out some highlight placements for yourself and see what is working and what is not. After that I painted his little blanket with deathclaw brown. I used the base layer consistency for the most part, but glazed over the recesses. Applied some highlights with ushabti bone and glazed some mournfang brown on the bottom part and the recesses, to make it a bit more interesting. For the little straps hanging on his shoulder, I covered those with mournfang brown and then used a mix of ushabti bone and mournfang brown just to roughly sketch some highlight over them. Lastly, I painted his nice cushion with corn red. Yeah, I couldn't really record this in a way that is visible what I'm doing, but I'm sure you guys can figure it out. With that, Jebediah is done. It was quite a journey to finish this grumpy old guy, but he is an awesome character, and if you paint him following Papa Laborc's tutorial, please send me the result through Instagram. So thank you for joining me on this little painting adventure. A huge thanks to my Patreons who support these kind of videos. With special shout out to, actually there will be no shout out, just some quality ASMR, because I don't want my neighbors to knock on my door and beat me up because I'm shouting here very loud. Okay? Okay.
Jonathan Rhodes, Cold-Blooded Dom, Trying to Paint Minis, Jonathan Mosner, Rulzak, Fled D, Earthapple 21, and Paints and Games. Yes, ASMR is so great.
If you want to support the work of Papa Laborc, you can do that on Patreon, where you can have early access to these videos, vote on the next mini, or you can sign up for online coaching with Papa Laborc. I hope the rest of your day will be as smooth as a granny's butt cheek.